Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks. Hey, if you're looking for teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, but you'd like to remember them in high quality jersey or uniform format, hey, some of those teams were legendary, some of them were disasters, but they all live at Royal Retros. Check them out. RoyalRetros.com. Use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Check them out now. And now, check out this episode.
Roger and Terry, we're going to come back and take a look at all of the plays a little bit later, but we do have some marvelous entertainment, something that may even be more exciting than the game we've just seen in the first half. Let's go down now to the field and Phyllis George. Phyllis?
Ladies and gentlemen, we have an exciting halftime extravaganza in store for you this afternoon. The National Football League is pleased to present Up with People, and a special performance featuring music of the 1960s, the decade the Super Bowl was born. Up with People is an extraordinary educational and cultural program for young people all around the world. So without further ado, let's welcome 430 young people from 24 countries. Ladies and gentlemen, Up with People! To bring back some of those unforgettable songs and sounds of the 1960s. It was a time of momentous change, and the music was changing too, with so many exciting innovations and instant legends. From the Beach Boys to the Beatles, Surfing to Soul, the Hootenanny to Motown, and here are just a few of the highlights.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right. I think you get the idea. How are you, everybody? It's Good Seats Still Available. My name is Tim Hanlon, and welcome to the proceedings. It is our weekly excursion into what used to be in professional sports, and we, of course, thank you profusely for finding us. Lots of choices out there in podcast land, especially over the Labor Day holiday weekend when you're really kicking back and hopefully relaxing and getting ready for some football. The pro variety comes back in earnest next week as we drop this show. Some interesting college games thus far, and lots of drama and intrigue to come, I'm sure, as the pros take their turn in this upcoming weekend. But we all know what this leads to by the end of the season. That is a thing called the Super Bowl, and we are honored to have the good professor, Dennis Deninger from Syracuse University, one of the original founders of the sports communications grad program there at the Newhouse School of Public Communications there at Syracuse. He is a professor at the Falk College as well there. And his brand new book is dropping on the 3rd of September, as this is roughly around when we're dropping this episode. How convenient, called The Football Game That Changed America, How the NFL Created a National Holiday. And yes, we're going to talk about the Super Bowl. It's sort of its origin story, kind of the odd way that it sort of came into being. Multiple broadcasts in its first year. You had two networks literally broadcasting this game simultaneously. That's completely unheard of these days, with two different production crews and the like. And things like halftime and the betting phenomenon, and just how it's become such a cultural touchstone for the United States. It is in many respects almost literally this close to a national holiday. There's been a lot of talk. You see these articles every year around that time when the idea of giving people the day off after the Super Bowl, that Monday that would be. So we're going to sort of get into all of that stuff. And, this is not a straight line. And this is sort of what we like to get into in this sort of what used to be sort of genre that we've created for ourselves here on this show. Nothing was set in stone in the mid 1960s. You had the AFL versus the NFL, the merger sort of meandering along and then sort of becoming its own thing, yet the two leagues kind of simultaneously existing. And then this thing called the Super Bowl. And we talked about that ad nauseum on previous episodes about Lamar Hunt and sort of coming together and creating the name of it with and all of it and stuff. Right. But the phenomenon the juggernaut that it has become clearly was not what it was going to become in the 1960s. I don't think anybody knew what this was going to be. They were just hoped that people would buy tickets for this thing. Would equate the AFL and the NFL and the integration of the two leagues would ultimately make this a superior product. And boy, has it become. And look, the halftime evolution is a really good, microcosm of all of this. And for those of a certain age, you may remember our the music aside there that you heard at the outset here. And that it's hard not to smile and laugh and chuckle and when you have to remember the halftime presentation at some of the earlier Super Bowls, like that one that you just heard in 1982. This was Super Bowl 16, I believe it was, in the Pontiac Silverdome. And that was Up With People. And Up With People, I think right now is sort of looked upon and fondly, but somewhat serio-comically. If you think about sort of the white bread, squeaky clean, wholesome, and arguably culturally maybe naive back in the day, for sure, and certainly by comparison to today. But that was Up With People is a fascinating group of young college-age students that came together to create great, music and halftime extravaganzas, as Phyllis George said there at the beginning. And the highlights of some of their programming was Super Bowl halftime shows. 1971 and Super Bowl V was their first one. Super Bowl X in 1976, they performed not only the halftime show, but also the Star Spangled Banner, big bicentennial monstrosity there. 1980 was Super Bowl XIV. They did the halftime show as well as in 2 years later, which you just heard. And then in 1986, arguably not only was it the last appearance of Up With People, but it is rumored that Pete Rozelle, then the commissioner of the league at that time, the morning after Super Bowl 20, expressing his profound displeasure at a decidedly less than performance, reportedly opened the meeting of his staff and the owners that morning with the following statement, quote, there are three words that I never want to hear again: Up With People. So no disrespect, but you have to remember this is a different time, different era. And boy, the halftime show of the Super Bowl has really become just a gargantuan thing and a tune-in event in and of itself beyond the game. But the game and all the things around it are what we're going to be talking about, how it came to be, its sort of meandering history, how it sort of evolved, and all of that fun stuff, the cultural phenomenon that has become this thing called the Super Bowl, with our guest this week, Dr. Dennis Deninger. And again, the book is called The Football Game That Changed America, How the NFL Created a National Holiday. It is forwarded by the great Chris Fowler of ESPN/ABC Sports. And you can get a copy of this book as it drops on the 3rd of September, which is, if you're listening to this live as we drop it on Monday, Labor Day, September 2nd, is available tomorrow, but you can order it today. If it's Monday the 2nd, you can order it today in pre-order fashion through our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 359 with Dennis Deninger, and you will find a convenient couple of links to both the Kindle and hardcover versions of this book. We appreciate that because we'll get a couple of referral nickels and dimes of love by doing so. And you'll enjoy this book as I did. I learned a whole bunch of things, lots of great trivia and ephemera around the evolution of this game. It's less about the actual competition as it is about sort of the cultural phenomenon that it has become. And if you feel yourself a football completist and an NFL super fan, well, you would do yourself proud by not only getting a copy of this book, but getting some learning about sort of how this game sort of evolved. And let's scratch the surface of such. Here's our conversation we had with Dennis back in May. Yes, we've embargoed it because the book is coming out like this week. So that's, we time these things. We try to do our best. And please, as always, sit back and enjoy. As you probably saw in my email, right, our focus is sort of on this, the things that used to be in professional sports. And we squint hard to kind of make excuses as to the kinds of conversations and stories and stuff that we try to go down to. The obvious things are teams and leagues that, are defunct or have come and gone, or, just become sort of curiosities. But we also love to get into origin stories of things that arguably we take for granted now, but in the earliest of days of their existence and certainly prior to them, a far different world that, frankly, people kind of maybe just of a certain generation or two or three don't even recognize. And I think the Super Bowl is absolutely one of those things, right? People of a certain age kind of just, wake up and just grow up thinking the Super Bowl thing had existed from time immemorial. And of course, it's clearly not the case. But before we get into that, give our audience a bit of a sense of your background as well as your adjunct into this story. Why are you the chosen one to tell us this history in this book and a little bit in this conversation?
My interest in the Super Bowl goes way back to when I was a kid, and the Super Bowl was introduced, and I was fascinated by watching it on television. And I wound up circuitously in a career in television and wound up as the first coordinating producer of SportsCenter at ESPN back in 1982, having left a job as an executive producer at Channel 7 in Miami. So I was at ESPN and we were covering sports all the time, and we were trying to cover as much of the big time sports without having all the big time sports on television. So I worked at ESPN, and I started out in SportsCenter, and then I created a show for Chris Fowler called Scholastic Sports America that was on for 4 years with Chris. And then I got promoted to a coordinating producer for live remote events. And I started covering live events around the world, and most of them tennis and soccer. I did World Cup soccer. I never did football. However, by the early 2000s, I was appointed head of production for ESPN Digital. And ESPN Digital covered every sport, and we had to cover every sport to attract an audience, a digital audience. So I covered my first Super Bowl, was Super Bowl 40. It was in Detroit, and that's now 19 years ago. And it was a great experience, and I covered a lot of sports all over. And I was working with John Clayton. John Clayton, the late, great John Clayton, was our reporter. So I got to take
Mom, I'm done with my stand up. That commercial just will always live on. What was it? I'm done with my stand up.
Yeah, my segment.
My segment. There you go. I'm like just best commercial, and just he's an all out straight out guy. He's fantastic.
He was, member of the writers wing of the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and we miss him. So he was the reporter. And I got into the locker room there, and that was the Steelers won the game. A young Big Ben was in there, 23 years old, and smoking a big stogie as they won the Super Bowl. So Ben Roethlisberger, so that was pretty cool. A number of years after that, I left ESPN just before they started laying a whole lot of people off, people similar to me. I spent 25 years at ESPN. And I had an opportunity to come back to my alma mater, Syracuse University. And I came up here to start teaching. And a few years after I began teaching, I was offered a position with our sport management department. And one of the ideas was, the Super Bowl affects America in so many different ways. There ought to be a course about it because the Super Bowl has an impact on America that is greater than most of the things you'll study in college. So we started this course back 14 years ago. And I was the professor of the Super Bowl and Society, and it became the most popular course in our sport management department. And the whole idea was to look at the Super Bowl and how it impacted us economically, culturally, socially, getting people together. It's basically the NFL created its own holiday. It's a secular holiday, but it stands out among these things that you do when people get together on a special occasion. So I've been researching the Super Bowl specifically for the last 14 years. I organized a program where we started taking Syracuse University students, and Syracuse University has always been famous for its sportscasters that we produce, starting way back with, Marv Albert and Dick Stockton, and you look at Mike Tirico and Bob Costas and a host of others. So I organized a program where we started taking undergraduates and got them credentialed as reporters to cover the Super Bowl on Radio Row. Credentialed, and they started we do live radio each day. They do a hit for the ACC network, which Syracuse University is proud part of. So I got pretty heavily involved in covering the Super Bowl from a variety of ways and researching the Super Bowl. And I went looking for a textbook. When you're teaching a college course, you need a textbook. And there really was no textbook about the Super Bowl and the impact that it had. There are lots of books about Super Bowl dynasties and the great teams of the Super Bowl and the rest of those. But there wasn't anything that addressed the kind of topics that I was teaching in this class. So I decided, well, if there isn't a book, then I've got to write a book. And the book here, The Football Game That Changed America, How the NFL Created a National Holiday, that's the result.
Well, and I'm guessing that your students maybe had a little bit of impact in the writing of this book and bringing it to life. No,
the students, their interest in the Super Bowl and their the number of people who came to class and were really interested in the topics. And what I guaranteed them was that once you take this class, you'll never watch the Super Bowl the same way again, in that you'll see so many different backstories about the Super Bowl that it'll have a different impact on you. And you might become the bore in the room who's constantly interjecting when they're watching the Super Bowl is, oh, I know this, or did you know that this is going on? So, but it's been great fun working with the students and taking their input and their observations and their questions and answering those questions.
Well, it's absolutely part of it's almost synonymous with modern day sports history, right? This game, because it's become so not only iconic, it's probably more than that. It's just become so many different things, as you're alluding to. But maybe a little bit for perhaps our younger audience here that kind of maybe don't sort of understand the origin story as much, right? You mentioned in the book, right, that a lot of the seeds of this were from the very earliest iterations of the NFL, even before it was called the NFL, right? There was always the championship game and all that kind of stuff to crown a champion. And clearly for decades, right, as this league grew and solidified itself and made itself through the war and came out the other side, all that stuff, it was it was born of a certain time in its life, and maybe a little bit of background as to why and how it sort of came about. I think some people probably just generally know the basics, but the AFL and all that kind of stuff certainly had a role. Let's put it that way.
Big role. The NFL started as the American Professional Football Association in 1920, and it was a group of these semi-pro football teams in basically the Midwest. 5 of the 10 teams were in Ohio. And the organizing meeting was at a Hupmobile, which was an old automobile, Hupmobile showroom in Canton, Ohio. And that's why the Pro Football Hall of Fame is in Canton, Ohio, because that's where it got its beginnings. And from 1920 until 1932, and it became the NFL 2 years later. They changed the name to the NFL in 1922. But not until there was no end of season playoff game. They just played, and it was kind of irregular scheduling, etc. But in 1932, two teams ended the season with only one loss. And they added what they called an extra regular season game to decide who would be the champion that year. They had always decided the champion just on regular season play. And that game was December 18th, 1932, between the Portsmouth, Ohio Spartans and the Chicago Bears. And Chicago won that, and it was the first postseason playoff game ever in the NFL. And the owners liked the result. My goodness, people are paying attention. It's a big game. So the following year, in 1933, the NFL divided into two conferences, and they purposely then had a championship game. So championships in the NFL go back to 1933. Television coverage of the NFL starts in 1939 with a defunct team called the Brooklyn Dodgers was hosting the Philadelphia Eagles, and it was on W2XBS, which became WNBC television. And it was probably seen by maybe just a handful of people because there were only maybe 20,000 television sets that had been produced at that time. But in 1939, this game was televised, and people may have given up on the NFL after that game because that championship game, that first game on television ended as a 0-0 tie. There was no television coverage of an NFL championship game until 1951. And there was a whole confluence. And what I teach in this course is history always has lots of different impact on all of us and everything. And if you think about it, 1951 you were just 5 years out of World War II. And just before the U.S. got involved in World War II, the 40-day work week was introduced. So people had more leisure, people had returned from the war, and there was a little bit more of an interest in, and we could watch some of these things on television. But in 1950, less than 9% of American homes had televisions. So if you knew somebody down the block that had a television, you were an NFL fan, you'd want to go down the block and, bring them a casserole or a dish to pass or something and say, "Ooh, is the game on?" The AFL, as you mentioned, was the primary mover in the creation of the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl was not a design. The NFL never thought of doing this big game at the end of the regular season. They always had the NFL championship, and that was their big game. And in fact, their big game in 1958 is what really got a lot of attention. In 1958, the New York Giants hosted the Baltimore Colts at Yankee Stadium. And it was on December 28th in 1958. And the thing that kind of was a precursor of the Super Bowl was the fact that the regular season had ended 2 weeks before this championship game. And the reason for the 1 week delay was that the Giants and the Cleveland Browns were tied they had the same record in their Eastern Conference. So they had to have a playoff to see who would play the Colts. So there was all this buildup that followed the regular season. And a guy by the name of Pete Rozelle was paying attention. And so was a guy by the name of Lamar Hunt. And Lamar Hunt, at the time, was 26 years old. And his father, H.L. Hunt, had billions of dollars to play with. And Lamar Hunt took it upon himself to say, "You know what? I would really like to bring a professional team to Texas." There were no professional sports teams in Texas at all. So he was looking at the possibility of bringing a Major League Baseball team and possibly bringing an NFL team, not both. After watching this game that was so exciting that ended in a sudden death the first sudden death ever in the NFL, because during the regular season, ties ended in a tie. If you ended the season, you were 8-3-1. They ended in a tie. So this was the first time that it had ever gone to sudden death overtime. And as people were watching on television, the audience grew and grew to over an estimated 40 million. So now you've got this young sport that it's growing and more people are paying attention. By 1958, over 80% of American homes had television. So this is a new thing that people had. So Lamar Hunt says, you know what? He had been a third string receiver for SMU, and he'd always had football was close to his heart. And he said, you know what? Football is going to be the way to go. And then he starts petitioning the NFL to grant him an expansion franchise for Texas, for Dallas. And he was going to call the team the Dallas Texans. And the NFL originally said no. And here is one of the reasons that they said no to this huge market that was developing in Texas was basically two things: lack of vision and greed. Lack of vision in not seeing that, we're going to have to expand where the population is growing, and greed in that at the time, there was no national television contract for the NFL in any city. The only nationally televised games was at the end of the year, the NFL championship game. The owners were making lots of money off of regional TV deals. So you could only watch the New York Giants games, for example, on TV stations in New York, Connecticut, New Jersey. You could only watch the Chicago Bears games in the region surrounding Chicago. And these owners were making a lot of money off of these regional TV deals. And they didn't want to go, expanding their league to cut into their profits. Any expansion would be, okay, now we're dividing the profits instead of 12 ways. We're cutting into it 14 ways, or this new team's going to be too close to my team, et cetera. So Lamar Hunt gets turned down. He's turned down by the NFL. What they tell him is, the Chicago Cardinals there used to be a Chicago Cardinals that would, competing for fan attention in Chicago with the Bears. Chicago Cardinals averaged 10 losses per season for the entire decade of the 50s. So the NFL said, look, we got a problem. The Cardinals are not making any money. They're not winning any games. If you can convince the owner of the Cardinals to sell you his team, well, then we'll let you move it to Dallas. But they weren't going to expand past 12 teams, right? So he goes and visits the owner of the Cardinals, who had married into the Bidwell family, which still owns the Cardinals. And this guy's name was Walter Wolfner. And he really liked the idea of being an NFL owner, and he didn't want to sell. In fact, Lamar Hunt visited him, flew down to his winter home in Miami, and made a pitch. And Walter Wolfner said to him, Sonny, there are a lot of guys that want to buy my team. And he starts naming off these people, Bud Adams in Houston and others who had tried it, because the NFL kept shuttling people down to, hey, see if you can buy Wolfner's team. He said, all these guys, these rich guys are trying to buy my team, and I'm not going to sell. So Lamar Hunt says, well, thank you very much, sir. And on the flight home, and he's the son of a billionaire, but he's flying coach. He's not flying first class. On the flight back to Dallas, he says, well, wait a minute. If there are all these bidders, all these rich guys who want to have teams, well, why don't I start a league? I'll contact these guys. We can start a different league, and we can all get teams in places that didn't have NFL teams, like Dallas and Houston and Denver, these and Minneapolis. So he starts contacting all these owners, and they said, yeah, let's do this. And they called themselves the Foolish Club. The AFL now represented a possible competition for the NFL. And Hunt, he went back to the Burt Bell was the commissioner at the time. He says, you know what, we'll get into the NFL if you'll let us in. And they said, no. So they start the process of building a league. And when they went on the air in 1960, they had a national television deal because they had never had any regional deals. They hired an attorney by the name of Jay Michaels. And Jay Michaels negotiated a deal with ABC Television for $8.5 million over 5 years. That was the first AFL contract. Every team got $212,000 a year for 5 years out of that deal. Pretty small. But Jay Michaels is a pretty famous son. His son Al Michaels went on to be one of the most respected broadcasters in NFL history. But when they went on the air in 1960, the AFL had a lot of innovations, and it was not your daddy's NFL. To start with, they designed a 14-game season, and the NFL had 12. That meant that in September, there were 2 weekends in which the only pro football you could watch was the AFL. And they were on ABC television, and one of the big advantages there was ABC assigned a young guy by the name of Roone Arledge to be the executive producer of this coverage on ABC television. And Roone Arledge introduced a lot of innovations that people liked. And another thing about the AFL was they were a completely integrated league. They saw great talent and great merit in people of all color, and they went from the beginning, they set out to have the best players in their league. In 1960, the Washington Redskins were still an all-white team. They did not become an integrated team until 1962. So the brand of football that people were seeing with the AFL was also a better brand of football. So the lack of vision, the greed among the NFL owners, we don't want anybody competing for our profits, actually shot them in the foot, and they wound up with competition. And one of the great ways that America expands, that America grows, is by competition and not by monopolization.
Well, part of that competition, right, was another word you could sort of bend into that is innovation, right? And in terms of televised coverage, in terms of offensive approaches and airing out the ball and that kind of stuff. And Lamar Hunt obviously sort of whipping that all into shape, and that leads into sort of the eventualities. Obviously, the merger, the conversations happened for a number of years, but maybe you can kind of like center into not only sort of the merger dynamics, right? Because it was sort of it kind of like almost like folding in over a course of a couple of years. But maybe you can explain where this championship game 2.0 sort of comes into play. This game that shall not be called the Super Bowl, at least not yet, and it wasn't for a couple of years in the beginning. But maybe you can kind of just walk us through a little bit of this, because I think a lot of people don't recognize. Obviously, with all the Roman numerals and stuff, people think that 1967 that was the first one, and that was it was just set in stone. But that it was actually retroactively renamed that after certainly that first one. And it wasn't necessarily a guaranteed success. Matter of fact, it was until the third one, it wasn't even guaranteed to go on further than the late 60s, right, even after the merger.
Early on, Lamar Hunt had proposed, once they started the league, he had proposed to the NFL that they have a common draft and that they have a championship game between the two leagues. The NFL said no, because they had just come off a bruising fight in federal court. The AFL had accused the NFL of antitrust and monopolization of professional football because they established a new team in Dallas to compete with Lamar Hunt's Dallas Texans, which after 2 seasons became the Kansas City Chiefs. And they also stole away, the NFL took the Minneapolis franchise and offered them a franchise. So the Minnesota bailed on the AFL, and they were replaced by a team in Oakland, California, which did pretty well for itself. So the competition for players is what forced the merger, in that there was an AFL bidding for the players and bidding for the same players that the NFL was drafting. And the AFL signed a new broadcast deal with NBC in 1964 that went from $8.5 million to $36 million. So now the AFL owners were flush with cash, and some of that cash went to signing a kid by the name of Joe Namath. The New York Jets signed Joe Namath right after the Orange Bowl in the beginning of 1965. and he became an instant sensation. But he was paid $427,000. And the top quarterbacks in the NFL, who'd been playing for years and playing for championships, said, well, if this kid can make $400,000, I must be worth $1 million. So the escalation of their salaries is what forced the NFL owners to say, we have got to merge or we're going to just drive ourselves out of business. Our profits are just getting lower and lower because we're having to pay too much for players. So yes, there was an agreement to let's merge these leagues, and they announced the merger on June 8th, 1966. And part of the announcement was that there would be a season-ending championship game between the AFL champion and the NFL champion, and they would meet at a neutral site, and also at a site that would be predetermined so that months and months or years and years of promotion could go into this game being at this site. So to build excitement. And Pete Rozelle, who was the commissioner at the time, he had just actually become commissioner in 1960. He started out as the public relations director for the Los Angeles Rams and then became their general manager. So he knew the value of the promotion that you could get from having this game. So yes, the first one was in January 1967. And it was, if it hadn't been for Lamar Hunt being turned down for getting an expansion franchise, there never would have been a Super Bowl. He just would have had his expansion team and it would have continued as the NFL championship. But as a result, it wound up being that much better and that much more important because then you had two leagues competing. You could plan ahead. You could have cities bidding for this great spectacular. And Pete Rozelle also knew the importance of making the media happy. He put $250,000 into the media budget for the first Super Bowl in order to make the media who covered it think, wow, this is better than covering the World Series. I mean, they had free trips to Santa Anita racetrack for the media. There was great catering for the media, free trips to Disneyland, all of these things that Pete Rozelle folded in to get more attention from the media. And 1967, first ever Super Bowl, and it was called the AFL-NFL World Championship because Pete Rozelle did not like what he referred to as these empty superlatives, neat, cool, super, all those things that were popular with the 1960s and the Rowan and Martin Laughlin era. So it was the AFL-NFL World Championship game, but it wound up with 79% of the homes tuned on watching television on that day, January 15th, 1967, watching this first ever Super Bowl. And it was an immediate hit. And it's grown ever since, and they've built on that.
That was also, though, a competition between two distinct leagues at that point, right? Because there was the NFL championship, which arguably still was the NFL championship, still the big dog of the two leagues, and playing the, I guess you could say, perceived, and maybe for the first two versions of this game, the acknowledged inferior league. So in some respects, as a football fan at the time, it's almost like in some respects, almost the best of times, because if you're an AFL fan, you get that championship. If you're an NFL fan, you grew up with that sort of legacy in your family, you get that championship. And now all of a sudden you get this almost bonus game of these two different leagues, and you can, it's pretty interesting that they were both separately playing in their own respective leagues, not unlike Major League Baseball at the time. Their World Series, right? But that changed as the merger became more specific.
And they had separate drafts. They, like Joe Namath was the number one pick for the AFL, and the Jets had that pick. The Giants happened to have the first pick in the draft for 1964. They held it just before the 1965. They used to hold their drafts in November, but the Giants had just had Frank Gifford retire. And they needed a running back, so they didn't pick Joe Namath as the number one pick. They picked a running back out of Auburn by the name of Tucker Frederickson. So either way, if the Giants had a shot at him, and they could have competed for his services. The Super Bowl in 1967 was between these two leagues. And, they when you're merging two leagues that they've been created separately, they had different roster sizes. They played with different footballs.
They had different broadcasters too.
Yeah, oh, that's right. And you know what? The CBS broadcasters were very upset that the Super Bowl came along because they had the preeminent football game every year, which was the NFL championship. And now their NFL championship became basically a semifinal game for this new Super Bowl. So Pete Rozelle figured out, you know what? We'll let each of you. NBC was covering the AFL games and CBS was covering the NFL games. He said, we'll let each of you have rights to televise it for $1 million each. So he raised another couple $1 million with the game right off the bat. And the combined, that 79% audience was the combined audience of CBS plus the NBC audience. And it's the only Super Bowl, number one, was the only one that two competing networks televised simultaneously. They both aired the game.
All right, what's this? Royal Retros. All right, longtime fans of this show may remember a little site that we used to promote the heck out of called 503 Sports. Well, not only are they still around, they are now known as Royal Retros. RoyalRetros.com, the king of throwbacks. And like the name implies, the highest quality jerseys and hats and apparel and all kinds of stuff related to various teams and leagues and situations that we love to obsess about here on this show. And I'm talking about getting jerseys with your name and number on the back of them, customized to your liking for the WHA or old NHL hockey teams that may not exist anymore. Perhaps it's a Federal League team from way back or a Negro League team. Maybe you're just enamored with the various football leagues of the past, like the Arena League or the All-American Football Conference or the original UFL, United Football League. Yes, you can get all of those teams in all kinds of colors, away jerseys, home jerseys. You want to put your name on them. You want to make sure you got the official patch on the side. All of those things and more at RoyalRetros.com. And I'm not kidding, friends. You go there, you want to find that Cleveland Barons jersey to wear and show. Hey, you're maybe a Colorado Avalanche fan and you want to represent the Quebec Nordiques from where they came in the arena to show your heritage and your love and knowledge of the history of that franchise. You can do that and more. And I'm talking across football and basketball and baseball and hockey and you name it. All kinds of great stuff for you to find and buy and purchase and wear proudly from Royal Retros. That's RoyalRetros.com. And of course, we have a promo code for you. We want to save you money from all these great things. And here's that code. It's SEATS, SEATS, promo code SEATS for all of your purchases at RoyalRetros.com. Check them out. You'll be glad you did. We love them. And our friend Destin Alameda there out in Portland, Oregon, we appreciate his and their sponsorship of this show. And now, back to our conversation. So when does the Super Bowl become the quote-unquote Super Bowl? Can you disavow us of the mythology of this and how much or how little Lamar Hunt had to do with it and the bouncing ball and this kid and all that stuff? And when did it get specifically chosen as the name and then became the official name going forward?
When they were having the initial talks after the decision to merge, there was a committee that included Lamar Hunt and Pete Rozelle and a few of the owners on either side. And they got tired of saying the AFL-NFL World Championship game, so they needed a shorthand. And Lamar Hunt was actually watching his kids play, and they had one of these little whammo Super Balls. And he thought, Super Bowl would be a cool kind of shorthand for this. And he wrote a memo to Pete Rozelle saying, I've been calling, we really need a handle. We need a name for this game. And I've been calling it the Super Bowl, but I'm sure we could do better. And Rozelle wanted to sound important, AFL-NFL World Championship game. He didn't like super. But the press immediately started calling it the Super Bowl because they got an inside word. Okay, these owners they kind of nicknamed it the Super Bowl, and so the press referred to it, and it was referred to as the Super Bowl from the beginning by everybody who was writing about it, talking about it. So by the third game, which is the one the Jets played and beat the Colts, upset the Colts, Pete Rozelle acquiesced to this tide of a popular opinion. And he said, all right, we'll call this one. So that was number 3 was the first one officially called the Super Bowl. And then what they did is retroactively renamed the first 2 Super Bowl I and Super Bowl II. And by adding the Roman numerals, they kind of satisfied Pete Rozelle's feeling that we need to make this sound important. And by attaching a Roman numeral, it added weight to it. It added a legacy, which it didn't have. When you're only the second or third game, it's not a big deal. It doesn't have this huge history. Like by that time, they were up to close to the 100th Kentucky Derby. So they also had the problem that you couldn't call it the Super Bowl 1965 if it was being played in 1966. You would decide the final game for the 1965 season would be in 66. This year, the final game for the 2023 season is in 24. So they wanted to avoid that confusion. So they agreed on Roman numerals, and it made it sound more important and have some gravitas to it.
Well, you also talk about the importance of that third game because the AFL actually won, right? And it in many respects probably did a lot more to solidify the importance of that game with its new name, maybe luckily, in that it no longer, it dispelled the myth of the inferiority complex that this now former AFL had, and effectively equated it, arguably still to be determined on the playing field during regular seasons. But it kind of, am I being too flip by saying that maybe the NFL got lucky with this game because of that?
Yes, absolutely. I talk about in the book, The Football Game That Changed America. I talk about how the game was looked upon as kind of the major league team being the NFL playing a minor league team. Because after the Green Bay Packers had beaten in succession the Kansas City Chiefs and then the Oakland Raiders and beat them soundly, the impression was that, this is really it's not an equal battle. And actually, the television ratings for Super Bowl III went down because, it's pretty clear to us that the NFL is better than the AFL and they're going to keep winning. So the first one got a great rating. Super Bowl II, the Packers were in it again. It was kind of a level rating, a little bit lower, but they really dropped after the first 2 with, the NFL has proven their superiority. And the Friday before Super Bowl III, Pete Rozelle had started doing his kind of state of the NFL news conference. And the NFL never called it that, but he would gather the press. And in that news conference on Friday, he said that, the owners were looking at, as part of this final agreement to merge the 2 leagues into an NFL, that we may look at changing the playoff structure so the 2 original NFL teams could play each other in a Super Bowl. You could get the Packers versus the Cowboys or the Giants versus the Rams in a Super Bowl because the competition didn't look like it was going to be very strong. And another thing about the competition is from the beginning, the NFL thought, we're going to just kick these guys in the pants because the AFL is just not strong enough. That was one of the reasons that Rozelle said we've got to have a big show at halftime, because if it's a blowout, we don't want people tuning out. We've got to have some kind of big spectacular at halftime that will keep people interested in, I'm going to watch this game and maybe I'll stay tuned for the third quarter. So there were a lot of things that were on the shoulders of the New York Jets, who were 18-point underdogs when they took on the Baltimore Colts. And one of the reasons that the Colts were such a big favorite was the Colts had, in the NFL championship game that year, their league, to decide who would go to the Super Bowl. they shut out the Cleveland Browns, something like 40-0. So the Colts seemed invincible going into this game. And Joe Namath, he famously at the Miami Touchdown Club dinner, when a Baltimore fan stood up, and Namath was there to receive the Player of the Year award, first time I'd ever gone to an AFL player for the Miami Touchdown Club. A fan stands up and he says, sit down. And Namath didn't like that sound of that. And he said, listen, we're here to win. We're going to win this game. And that was his famous prediction and his guarantee. And he also got kind of lucky in that people then, it added even more storylines and it added more importance to this AFL victory. And then the Chiefs came back in the following year and they won. So after 4 years, the Super Bowl was 2 games for NFL and 2 games for original AFL teams.
All right, let's skim through some of these themes here, though. That as this game sort of became sort of the titan of championships that it is today. Maybe you can kind of describe some of those thematics, right? Because I think certainly you mentioned television is very much part and parcel of the success of this game. You mentioned halftime entertainment. You're talking to somebody who remembers the golden days of Up with People, and that was a pretty darn good halftime show, but clearly it pales in comparison. But also I guess those who have glommed on, right? So tastemakers and advertisers as part of that mix, right? All of those things, plus, frankly, even politicians, right? Looking at this as sort of the almost the quintessential apple pie event in America's yearly calendar. Arguably, probably, and obviously increasingly the most watched event. Maybe a little bit of understanding of some of those threads that I guess who brought who to that party. I mean, the Super Bowl is effectively a football championship, but it morphed in the 1970s into something so much more than that is just, it's now more gargantuan than just that.
Yeah, you can think of it as a colossus. And it's just gained this inertia each year as more and more people would watch. And the advertising became a big deal. And a couple of major things happened in 1984. In 1984, Apple introduced the Macintosh with a 1-minute commercial that was directed by Ridley Scott. And it was based upon the themes of George Orwell's 1984, when there's a big brother looking over everybody's shoulder, and everybody's kind of a pawn to these powerful forces. And Apple was going to break that the PC rule and do something different. And so that was the first commercial that was ever designed strictly for a Super Bowl. Everybody talks about some of the great Super Bowl commercials and Mean Joe Green and, hey, you can have my Coke. That commercial was airing during the regular season before the Super Bowl of that year. And most of the ads that you would see in the Super Bowl were just, okay, they had played during the regular season and we'll put an extra buy in the Super Bowl. So suddenly there was something else to look for during a game. And the other thing about 1984 is that was the first year of a 40-year run in which the Super Bowl has been the most watched event. The year that the TV series MASH ended, their finale actually got more viewers than the Super Bowl in that year. But every year since the conclusion of MASH, the Super Bowl has grown and grown in its size of its audience. And as the size of the audience grows, then the attention paid to it, the performers who were interested in playing. You mentioned Up with People. The mastermind of the original halftimes was this guy by the name of Tommy Walker, who had been hired away from the Walt Disney Company. And he saw this 100-yard field as this canvas upon which he had to have lots of things going on all at once. So a group like Up with People with 300, 400 members out there dancing around. And they actually did, when they did the first Super Bowl in Detroit, they did a salute to Motown with Up With People. And there is nothing less Motown or less urban or less interesting than Up With People. And after that game, Joe Brown, who was Pete Rozell's assistant, said that when they had their Monday or Tuesday morning meeting after the Super Bowl, Pete Rozell had a cigarette in his hand and he put the cigarette down. He said, there are 3 words I never want to hear again: Up With People. And they moved on from this kind of vanilla halftime. And the rock concerts began in 1993 with Michael Jackson at the Rose Bowl. And again, the NFL was kind of forced into this because the previous year, the Super Bowl was in Minneapolis, and they had it was a winter festival, a winter carnival was their theme. And they've got people dressed as snowflakes dancing around all over the field. And Gloria Estefan was singing. Brian Boitano was out there skating on some plastic ice. And it was the new Fox network had seen what these variety shows, that the kind of throwback variety shows the NFL was doing. And what Fox decided to do was promote ahead of time, hey, if you tune over to Fox, we'll give you a brand new live edition of In Living Color with Damon Wayans and Jamie Foxx, and it's going to be fun. And what happened was 25 million viewers who'd watched the first half of the Super Bowl tuned away from halftime to watch In Living Color on Fox. And once you got over there, they had a countdown clock. And okay, the game's going to start in 18 minutes and 16 seconds. So it's just counting down. So you weren't going to miss any football action. So that taught the NFL a lesson in, okay, we cannot continue on with variety shows out there, try to fill the field. We've got to get the biggest names in rock music. And Michael Jackson lit it up at the Rose Bowl, and it's been a rock concert ever since.
And the advertising thing, right? So that sort of that sort of cross, if you will, from that sort of most viewed television show arc in the 80s when the Super Bowl became, and then basically held on to the most viewed program each and every year. When would you sort of kind of put a pin in, the time that the Super Bowl really kind of made it as the quintessential advertising platform? Because I would argue that even in the 70s, when it was still drawing a substantial audience and advertisers. I mean, I remember back in the days, back in the 70s, right? Master Lock would famously put all of most of its advertising budget in the one commercial that would be seen in the Super Bowl. And, if you happen to be at the bathroom or, grabbing a snack or something at that time, you'd miss Master Lock's entire annual budget, that 30 seconds or that 1 minute. But I think that's the beginning of the insanity, was kind of around then, even though it wasn't the largest event on television that year.
Right. The first year that $1 million was charged for a Super Bowl ad was, I believe, in 1996. And now it's $7.5 million. So the power of the Super Bowl to launch products, to get people interested in new movies that would be coming out in the spring and the summer, just the obvious power of the Super Bowl to launch products and to get people interested in this huge mass audience. If you wanted a general audience, you're not ESPN. You're not just looking at only male sports fans at the time. You're not any of the networks that are just looking at a narrow audience. You get the broadest possible audience, and if you're going to introduce a product that will appeal to men, women, people of all ages, well, that became the place to do it. So, and each decade, the number of people watching the Super Bowl has increased so that now it's averaging over 110 million viewers per minute. And whenever they give those numbers, it's always per minute, because when you think about it, this year's the Nielsen reported 124.9 million. Well, that's still 200 million short of the population of the United States. You think, wait a minute, 200 million people were not watching the Super Bowl? Now, the case is that they take the average per minute, so 124.9 million were watching per minute, but about 204 million people watched at least a portion of the Super Bowl. They just weren't watching all at the same time.
And when would you argue that the game, and maybe you kind of answered the question earlier, the game became has become or did become less about the fans in the stands than it was about the audience at home, right? The sheer size difference and stuff. But I think it's interesting too, because the spectacle, right, becomes, while it's still a tough ticket, it's clear that the halftime and the television audience and the advertising, all these things, it becomes more of a TV show first and foremost than a championship football game on the field, it seems, right? Because of all this extra stuff that it now needs to be for so many others besides the two teams playing a game of football.
Right. This is the number one show for sports. It's also the most watched entertainment program of the year. It has the largest, broadest audience. It has an impact on, it's the most wagered event of the year. It's got all of these different powers that have attached to it as it has added this inertia continuing forward. And it's not going to stop. I mean, you can project forward, and I do in the book, The Football Game That Changed America. I start projecting forward as to what could we expect to see for Super Bowl 100 in the year 2066, because it is just going to accrue greater and greater power and affect us in more and more ways.
We all know what it's become. What do you attribute its standing and its power? I mean, how much of this is the NFL and how much of this is television? This is a mind meld, right, of two colossuses of cultural significance, and who knows how long this mutual admiration lasts. But it almost feels, in many respects, and my day job is in the television and media business. Depending on who you talk to, the NFL seems to be propping up broadcast television.
Yes.
It's so symbiotic, right? And it's so exemplified in this one massive game at the end of every season. Can it get any bigger than it is now? And with streaming and all these other things siphoning people's attention, yet it still remains totemic in overall viewing. Can it last that long further?
Yes, definitely. And the NFL is making a concerted effort to expand the interest in the Super Bowl to more and more countries. I believe that the international audience for the Super Bowl this past year was in excess of 50 million. And that's where they're putting their focus. And because American football is not the most popular sport in the world by a long shot. Soccer is way ahead when it comes to total fans globally. Tennis and horse racing and Formula One auto racing have more combined fans worldwide than NFL football does. But the NFL they have a number of programs in place they're trying to connect teams with different parts of the globe. And another major factor that's going to affect the international reach of the NFL is the reintroduction of supersonic aircraft. And supersonic, the new breed, the new edition of supersonic aircraft is going to be coming out by the end of this decade. And in fact, they're already being tested for a couple different companies are creating these. And it'll make travel from the West Coast of the U.S. to Japan 8 hours. And it'll make travel from the United States to Great Britain in 3.5 hours, which, teams travel far longer than that if Seattle has to play Miami. So as society changes, as technology changes, those leagues that see the future, see, okay, how can we best utilize the changes, the technologies that are occurring? How can we put them to best use? Well, those are the ones that will thrive in the years to come, and those that don't they'll be superseded.
So ironically, this most American of cultural and sports events may in our lifetime occur on soil outside the United States, given all of this, right? Because the NFL's growth, it's kind of getting to a point of saturation here in the United States. I mean, we could talk about Netflix getting 2 Christmas games and stuff, and this season coming up as we record this, right? Just about every day of the week, it's going to have an NFL game during the course of the season as it plays out, right? There's already some whispers of, is the league spreading itself too thin by, yet another streaming partner, all that kind of stuff, but internationally, though, it just seems to be that's kind of where any future growth is most likely to happen. And I got to think that along with that will be the promissory of a game outside the U.S.
I can see a championship playoff game if a team based in London has the best record and they're in a division with a team from New England or from New York. If they have a better record, I could see a championship game being played over there. But I got to tell you, I wouldn't want to be the commissioner of the NFL in front of the congressional panels, the congressional hearings that would be immediately put together if they announced plans to take this most American of events and put it on foreign soil. It would be like the population of Kentucky rebelling if somebody said, well, we're going to take the Kentucky Derby and we're going to move it from Louisville to Paris. People would be up in arms. So I really don't see a Super Bowl being scheduled outside the United States, but maybe I'm being short-sighted.
How about on some form of pay television instead of broadcast television, right? Again,
congressional hearings on that one too.
Well, sure, but I mean, streaming is where all the money is, and there's not much of the television industry without it. And the NFL, arguably, if they decide to, if the NFL catches a cold or decides, I mean, with private equity now circling around investing in this league as seemingly inevitable, right? Private equity money does what private equity money does, right? And the valuations would only go further to the stratosphere and would necessitate even higher revenue streams, which literally and figuratively would be streams, because with the Amazons and the Googles and the Netflixes of the world, right? But you don't see that the freely available version of this game being challenged anytime soon, despite all of that lust for more revenue.
I can see it being shared, like, for the past several years, it has been simulcast as a stream, and that streaming audience has grown every year. If you're any sports league, you have to go where the viewers are. And if you're stuck on cable television and the viewers are, they're en masse, they're deserting cable television and moving to streaming. Well, if you want to keep your product relevant, you have to move it over to streaming. But when you mentioned pay-per-view, that's an option that's always been there for the NFL. They could decide that, well, we're not going to include the Super Bowl in the negotiations with our broadcast partners. We're going to do it as a standalone pay-per-view, which would mean that it would be bought up by people who could afford the purchase price. And then what you do is you close out the potential group of young fans who are growing up in households that couldn't afford, say, $100, but to buy the Super Bowl. And imagine, I mean, they could sell it easily. For the past several years, the NFL could have sold a pay-per-view of the Super Bowl. And if you sold $100 to, say, 50 million households, not even 100 million, right? But 50 million households, that's $5 billion in one day that the NFL could earn if they went the pay-per-view route. So that number has probably been dangled in front of them a number of times, but they're interested in the broadest, largest possible audience. And I think anytime that you have a pay-per-view, there is a bit of a wall there over which a lot of people in lower incomes can't scale that wall.
Yeah. That said, though, right, broadcast linear television, right, is not so arguably anymore in secular decline. And there's not much that broadcast television and even linear cable television brings anymore that is live. I mean, arguably the percentage of stuff that's live and or original, certainly sports seems to be a big part of it. But other than that, the originality of stuff tends to be more streaming first. I guess let me put it another way. Netflix has what? How many? 200, almost 300 million subscribers in some way, shape, or form globally.
Yes.
Right. That pales in comparison by an order of magnitude. The highest audience that the Super Bowl has ever gotten in the United States by itself. Right. So I don't, and plus Netflix is a pay service. I don't know. It just, I wonder, given all the changing dynamics of television, the media industry, and where the revenues look to be coming from in the future, it doesn't stand. It wouldn't surprise me if it becomes a serious conversation somehow, and maybe it's reversed, right, where it's a stream first thing, and the broadcast thing is kind of, a basic version is kind of thrown out there for those who can't afford it, so to speak, right? Not unlike what Netflix, not unlike what the NFL historically has done with pay television in the local markets where the teams are playing. They'll throw them a bone and put it on broadcast television.
As the audience migrates, every sports league is going to have to attach a greater importance to those platforms upon which more people are watching. So, yes, in the next round of negotiations, it may very well be that the broadcast networks don't pay a huge increase. They don't pay as much.
Or frankly, can't.
Right. And because they're not reaching as many people. And the advertisers who are providing the dollars, those advertisers want to reach the broadest audience. And if a huge percentage of your audience is over on streaming, then what you want to do is, all right, we'll be paying for our ads, and we know that we're going to get 45% of our audience is going to be on broadcast and 55% will be via streaming. We'll pay 100%, but we know that it's going to, the number of people are going to be watching on a different platform. Technology is amazing. The more things that you can do and change, everybody who pays attention to change and adapts with change will succeed. And you can't, right? Sports has basically been propping up basic over-the-air television and the basically the pay TV, the cable and satellite delivered television for a long time. And if it weren't for sport last year, sport had 94 of the top 100 shows on broadcast television in the United States. So if it weren't for sports, I'm not sure that there would be a broadcast industry.
So, all right, here's my last question, though. So given sort of this amazing history of this game and just the outsized importance of it on so many different cultural levels beyond just the crowning of a champion of a football league, where can it go from here, right? Can it get any bigger? And frankly, what could go wrong? I mean, I will say this. I have been old man yelling at the clouds for some time with this silly little show. Not that I'm longing for the old days of sports and stuff, but with every step into gambling and private equity money and valuations going through the stratosphere, and the average fan increasingly having a very difficult time just being able to afford going to just a basic regular season game of any sort. It just feels to me like the big part of business is getting ever bigger. And you just wonder as to when does that bubble ever burst? And the biggest of those inflations, right, is the Super Bowl. I wonder, is there ever a ceiling for this game, or is this just going to be something we're talking about 30 years from now? It's just even bigger still.
With the legalization of gambling, as you mentioned, the Super Bowl its economic impact on the United States has grown dramatically. This past year, an estimated $23 billion was bet on the Super Bowl. And that brings it, in my estimation, in my book, the total economic impact of the Super Bowl to greater than the gross domestic product for an entire year for many nations. It's over $40 billion and growing. So if people don't stop gambling, which I don't think they're going to stop gambling, and if people don't stop buying new products, and you can advertise new products in the Super Bowl, I don't see it getting smaller. I can see it growing and becoming more things to more people in a variety of different ways. I've got a few suggestions as to what might happen for Super Bowl 100 and how the NFL might deal with that you got to pick up the book to see what the projections are. But it's not going to get smaller. And unless at some point people say, we're tired of football, we'd rather watch pickleball. And that's not going to happen.
All right, our thanks to Dennis. And the book is available, well, depending on when you're listening to this. If you're listening to us in real time on the Monday the 2nd, it will be available tomorrow the 3rd. If you're listening on September 3rd or onward from there, it's available now. Either way, get the book. It's called The Football Game That Changed America, How the NFL Created a National Holiday, by our guest this week, Dennis Deninger, who spent a ton of time. We didn't kind of really get into too much of it, but at ESPN as sort of head of production for many years, 25 years or so in the 80s and 90s. And it is appropriate that Chris Fowler, current of ESPN and ABC Sports, is the guy who does the forward for this book. And if you're not a student at Syracuse, well, if you are a student at Syracuse, make sure that you try to get into this class. It's called Super Bowl in Society. I guess we'll just have to be just comfortable with the idea of possibly auditing it someday, but I'm not going to press the issue. For now, the book will have to do, and it is available now wherever you get good books. You can, of course, go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 359, and you'll find a couple of links that'll take you to both the hardcover and Kindle version of this book. Again, The Football Game That Changed America, How the NFL Created a National Holiday. It is published by our friends at Rowman and Littlefield. And we appreciate you purchasing it by that means, because we'll get a couple of nickels and dimes of referral love, and that goes to the kitty to keep our lights on and the hamster wheel going, to keep keep things going on around here. We appreciate that. While you're online, stop by, like I said, our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Lots of things to explore there. All of our episodes are posted there. But you should be subscribing or following us on your various podcast feeds to get it more directly ingested into your systems. You'll find a merch section there, among other things, and a lot of great stuff there from our friends at Good Seats Still Available. That's me. That's us. Come on. At oldschoolshirts.com and at royalretros.com, as well as a whole bunch of great merch from or through the auspices of TeePublic right there on our merch page at goodseatsstillavailable.com. If you're doing the socials thing, you can find Dennis on the Twitter X thing and maybe a few other places, but I'm certain on the Twitter X thing at D Deninger, he says. That's D as in David, D as in David, Eninger, D Deninger. You'll find us at Good Seats Still on the Twitter X thing, and you'll find us everywhere else on the socials at Good Seats Still Available. Our email address is hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And our thanks, of course, as always, to Jerry Payne, Mr. Audio Excellence himself. And we thank you for listening. Stay up with people. Keep that vibe going as we get into fall. And we hope you have a wonderful, and hopefully had a wonderful long weekend. And we'll see you next week. We appreciate your listenership. Bye-bye.